Well, folks entering the room seem to have slowed up a bit, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Kostelny, CEO of Preservation Virginia, and I want to welcome you to the first in a two-part series of our Summer Preservation Academy on fundraising. This topic can seem daunting. Where do you start to write a grant? How do you approach a donor? Where can you find the money to take your project from a good idea to a great completed project? What roles do others play in helping to raise funds? Tonight, our panel will start to demystify the process, share information about some of the statewide sources for grants, and offer tips how to organize for the success of your grant requests and fundraising efforts. We'll also touch on some trends in philanthropy and the role of individual donors in making your aspirations a reality. And hint, every member of your team has a role in making your fundraising efforts a success. To organize this webinar, we're grateful to our partners at the Department of Historic Resources. And I also want to thank Peachtree House Foundation and each of you for attending tonight's event and for supporting Preservation Virginia's efforts year-round. These past 2.5 years of uncertainty have been weathered because of you. Now, before we launch into our topic this evening, we really want to hear from you. How did you hear about this webinar? That will help us as we promote future programs and make sure we're casting the broadest possible net to have participants. If you would take a second or two just to type that into the chat box, we'd very much appreciate it. While you're typing, there are some housekeeping items I just wanted to share. We know you all are going to have questions, and to help organize our time, we'll save questions to the end. But please feel free to type your questions at any time while the presenters are, while our panelists are presenting. The best way to do that is to type them into the Q&A box. We'll be collecting those questions and we'll try to answer as many as possible as time provides. We'll be using the chat feature to share with you links on websites and other programs that are recommended by our panelists. And those also will be compiled and sent to you after the broadcast. This program is being recorded and will be posted on both Preservation Virginia's and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources website. And I know that we have our board chair, Jenny Keller, present, so I wasn't sure if she wanted to offer any words of welcome.
Good evening, everyone. It's very nice to have your participation. This is really an important aspect of what we do, and I thank everyone for participating tonight and our partners and sponsors. I'm really looking forward to this session because as Elizabeth says, this is how we implement our grand ideas. So good luck to all of you, and I look forward to learning along with you this evening. Thank you, Jenny.
And thank you for your leadership for the past 2.5 years. It's been incredible.
Thanks,
now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's program, Dr. Lisa Nguyen Bryan. She joined our team as the Community Outreach Manager just this past June, so we're already putting her to work. Her efforts will focus on strengthening the networks and the network of organizations and sites related to the Black and Indigenous people in Virginia, and launching our new African American Fellows program next spring. She brings to this role a deep appreciation of spaces and places where history happened, and a proven record in championing and advancing the goals at historically Black colleges and universities in Virginia. She holds a doctorate in education from VCU and a master's in education and an undergraduate degree from James Madison University. and she's a recent graduate of VCU's African American Studies program. Lisa is the perfect person to moderate our program tonight, from her background in development and for her passion for community and for history. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Nguyen Bryan.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm excited to be a part of the family at Preservation Virginia. And I also want to say again, welcome to all of our participants for this evening. You may hear a little thunder in the background. I know it's raining in different spaces, but hopefully we will stay connected. So again, welcome. I want to take a moment just to introduce you to some of the people that you see on the screen, and they will provide some expertise that you'll need as you move forward in pursuing some of these fundraising opportunities. Our panelists for this evening, we have Bowe. Bowe is the manager for advancement initiatives at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, where she oversees the museum's planned giving and member travel program, along with this new grant-making program, the Commonwealth History Fund. In her 28 years at VMHC, she's held several positions, including management of their annual fund and membership programs. So thank you, Kathy, for joining us this evening. Following Kathy will be Blake Mcdonald. Blake is a native of Albemarle County, now residing in Richmond. Blake studied architectural history at Connecticut College and the University of Virginia. As the Architectural Survey and Cost Share Program Manager for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, he travels throughout the Commonwealth supporting the stewardship of Virginia's diverse past. So thank you so much, Blake, for participating. And last but not least, we have our very own Preservation Virginia, Will Glasgow. He was born and raised in Richmond. Will became interested in Virginia history and culture at a young age. He graduated college in 2008 with a degree in creative writing from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And his first job out of school was working for the American Civil War Museum here in Richmond. And he's been leading our development team and communications program at Preservation Virginia since 2014. So welcome, Will. And I just want to mention also another moderator, and we'll be volleying back and forth in the chat with your questions, is Sonia Ingram. And Sonia is also my colleague in what we do for Preservation Virginia. So Sonia's waving. And I do want to, again, acknowledge Elizabeth. Elizabeth is our Chief Executive Officer of Preservation Virginia, the nation's first statewide historic preservation nonprofit organization. And she served in this capacity since 2001. So if there is a question that you have, Elizabeth has the answer. So she is a veteran in this area and will offer her expertise as well. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to allow our presenters to make their presentations. Don't be concerned about trying to capture everything and taking copious notes. We will have this information available for you on our website. But we are very interested in your questions, so keep them coming. And I am going to turn it over to Bowe.
Thank you, Lisa. Give me a second while I share my screen with you. There. I'm sorry. There you go. Do you have it?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for having me in this presentation. The Commonwealth History Fund is a new grant-making and an endowment at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It was established with generous funding from Dominion Energy, and it's also administered by with the partnership from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. The fund was created to fund projects across the Commonwealth, history-based projects, and they range from a variety of eligible projects. The considerations for the grants include the significance of the project or resource and the impact on the community and the state. Also, the project's focus on historically underrepresented topics and communities, and the need for funding and the urgency for the project. And to be an eligible applicant, you have to be a Virginia nonprofit 501c3 organization or a state and federally recognized American Indian tribe. Local government agencies are applicable. Unfortunately, individual researchers are not. So you have to be affiliated with a nonprofit, an educational institution, and so forth. Projects run the gamut. We tried to make this as accessible to all kinds of projects throughout the state, including restoration, rehabilitation, and other related building and construction projects, preservation and conservation projects, research and documentation, publications, the acquisition of property, land, and objects, landscape or infrastructure improvements, project planning, educational programs and outreach, and digitization and website projects. The grant will not support endowment support, general operating support, advertising, and promotion. However, those costs might be rolled into an overall project and be applicable for funding. Grant conditions include a thorough and compelling application. The award winner needs to sign, or the organization needs to sign, a binding contract agreeing to the terms of the program. The project must begin within 6 months of being awarded the funding, and the organization must submit a final report and financial accounting of the grant funds. And I spelled out this next slide for all of the grant criteria, because these points are what your grant is being ranked by. So I'll talk about the ranking system in a minute, but again, the significance of the project and its impact on the community, a focus on underserved people, communities, and narratives, the funding urgency of the project, how the monies will be allocated, and the organization's proven ability to secure other funding. Matching grants and in-kind grants aren't required, but if you have those, we would like to see those in your budget. The project timeline, scope, scale, and the level of professionalism of the people involved with the project. Speaking to the next bullet point, the qualifications of the personnel, volunteers, of your organization in carrying out this project, and the applicant's history, support from the fund. Granted, this was our first year in awarding grants, so that's not a viable bullet point at this point in time, but we hope to keep giving funds away to organizations throughout the whole state. And I've already touched base on the matching funds and in-kind support. The grant applications requirement, the process is on our website, and there is an application, a PDF application for you to fill in, along with a template for the budget. when you, and there's also a guidelines on the website, and it spells out in detail all of these bullet points that are in this presentation. But application requirements include proof of the organization's eligibility and location within Virginia. So even though if you have to be in the state of Virginia, and you have to substantiate your nonprofit, your tribal association, and other things, and that's what that refers to. A letter of consent from property owners or a governing body if you're purchasing land. We also require a detailed description of the project timeline, explanation of need and impact, and if there's relevant images, charts, reports, and assessments that have already been done, that is helpful for your request. And again, I've talked about substantiation. So supporting documents that are required are your tax exempt status from the IRS, or your 7871 RIC section 7871, your current fiscal year operating budget, the project budget, your most recent financial statement or a review report or a compilation report. We know that these reports are expensive, so if you don't have one of those, we will accept your current operating budget in lieu of those. And your most recent Form 990, a list of your board of directors. These are all pretty standard documents and supplemental materials that most grantees want to see. We would like to have digital images and logos if you are an awardee, so that we can use that for marketing the program. Biographical sketches of the people involved with the project, up to 3 letters of endorsements or references from organizations, individuals who want to see you succeed in getting the project off the ground and completed. In eligible projects, I did mention this earlier, but we will not fund projects for religious or lobbying purposes. And then for the application, when you are done with your application and you've got all your supplemental documents compiled, you will email me at virginiahistory.org, and I will send you a dedicated link to a folder on OneDrive for you to upload all of those documents into. And then once those are received, we have a review panel that is comprised of people from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. They rank the applications based on those criterias on a scale to 1 to 5. There's a rubric that's been set up. And so most of those are all ranked from 1 to 5 or a 1 to 3 scale. And then that's all compiled. All applications are reviewed. And that compilation report then goes on to a volunteer award panel, again, staffed by people from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and Virginia Department of Historic Resources, historians, curators, and they look at the rankings from the review panel, and they make suggestions to our president and CEO, Jamie Boskett, and then decisions are made on who is awarded and how much. Another consideration that was important for us was to be able to award projects across a broad geographical reach to support statewide initiatives, which is an important objective of our own educational mission. So that was a definite consideration in picking the award winners this year. And then a final report is required, and it needs to be compiled within a short period after the completion of the project or at the end of the project period, and a narrative account and accomplishments resulting from the grants, a description of the progress made toward achieving the objectives and quantifiable measurements of that progress. And the report must be completed and accepted prior to applying for any further grants from the Commonwealth History Fund. On that note, we will accept multiple proposals in the same grant making cycle from the same organization. We also will provide funding in subsequent years, but you have to reapply. We will not award multi-year grants. And I just, you know, we talked about state funding. I think people think the Virginia Museum of History and Culture is a state agency. It is not. We are a private nonprofit that's been around for 191 years. So we were presented with this great opportunity from Dominion to set this grant making cycle up that will award close to about $200,000 in its first 5 years. And this year we awarded 12 organizations with about $200,500. I think that's on my next, or 402,000, excuse me, $402,500 in this first year. And this map demonstrates the reach throughout the state of where those organizations are. And I've got a quick list of those organizations, where they're at, and the title of their project. There is, if you go to virginiahistory.org/history fund, you will see a press release that details more and further the projects from these organizations. Our next cycle is being jump started this year. So we will accept applications from October 1st through the 31st, and awards will be announced in early 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We've gotten some questions and we'll hold them to the end. But this is really fascinating, and congratulations on receiving this funding to share with the community. That's excellent. All right, Blake, you are up next.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who is attending tonight. It's great to see such a packed attendee list. Again, I'm Blake Mcdonald. I'm the Architecture Survey Manager and Cost Share Program Manager at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. And I'm really happy to be here tonight to share some current as well as upcoming grant opportunities at the Department of Historic Resources. I am one of several DHR staff members who helps to manage grants. And just like our friends at Preservation Virginia, we receive very frequent inquiries about the availability of grant funds. Our ability to support grant fund projects has been pretty limited, but thanks to several new funding sources, we look forward in the coming state fiscal years, this and the next, to funding much more preservation work. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of our existing grant programs, as well as some of those new grant funds. I want to preface everything that I'm going to share with you by saying that several of those new grant funds we only just learned about in the state biennium budget late last month, and we are still in the early stages of organizing how those funds are going to be distributed. So the big takeaway message from me tonight is going to be to stay tuned to DHR as we build those new programs. But before we get there, I want to zoom out for just a moment I'm here representing the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. We are the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state and territory has one. You can see our very broad mission down at the bottom of the screen here. I hope that you are already familiar with at least some of our program areas. They include the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places, which we administer here in the state of Virginia. Our very robust state and federal rehabilitation tax credit program, and of course, our historical highway marker program, the silver and black signs on the sides of Virginia's roads. We already have a small bunch, a handful of currently available or annually available grant programs that we manage. Those include our African American Cemetery Fund for the care and maintenance of African American cemeteries and graves dating to before 1948. We've got the Revolutionary War Cemetery Fund for the care and maintenance of Revolutionary War patriot graves. We've got our certified local government and cost share survey and planning grant programs, which are designed to support preservation planning projects brought to us proposed by local governments, localities. We've got our threatened sites program, which provides small grant amounts for the assessment, excavation, processing, and reporting of archaeological sites that are under immediate threat of destruction. The Battlefield Protection or Preservation Fund, which supports the protection of battlefield lands associated with Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. And finally, we have our disaster grants, which are federal monies that we administer for damaged historic properties when that fund becomes available. So we distributed a little bit over $1 million after Hurricane Sandy, and we're currently spending down money allocated for historic resources and areas that were damaged by Hurricanes Michael and Florence in 2018. So that's a very quick snapshot of our currently available grants. Each of these grants does have a DHR staff person assigned to it. It's got a manual with clearly defined requirements and application process. All of that information, all those contexts, those manuals can be accessed on the grants tab of DHR's webpage. I put a screenshot of it up here and a link to it down in the bottom. If you haven't already explored this portion of our webpage, highly encourage you to do so. This is also where we'll be posting pages for our new grant funds. So moving on to those new grant funds, the recently released biennium state budget was a very exciting one for us at the Department of Historic Resources because we received allocations to support a large new fund for historic resources associated with Virginia's Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. In addition to that one large fund, we also received money to support a tribal outreach coordinator and a small fund associated with their work. And then some of you on the call this evening may have already had the opportunity to work with Tim Roberts, who was hired on at DHR last year as our community outreach coordinator focused on African American communities. Tim's role also has a very small grant fund associated with it, and that will become available to the public as an application-based competitive grant this state fiscal year as well. For a small agency like DHR, these new opportunities represent a great deal of additional work that we want to be doing. And so we're also glad that the biennium budget included money not just for that tribal coordinator, but also for a grants manager to get these funds out the door. Both the tribal outreach coordinator role and the grants manager role are currently posted. We want to get these folks hired and situated at DHR as quickly as possible. The application deadline is this Friday, so I hope you'll help us to spread the word or consider applying yourself if your skill set matches what we're looking for. Full information can be found at jobs.virginia.gov. I'm now going to share a little bit more information with you about those 3 new grant funds. But I once again want to highlight the fact that these funds are still in development, and therefore some of the specifics around the grant requirements, the applications, and the selection process, exactly how this money is going to be distributed, those are not yet available. So moving on, the first and the largest of our new funds is that Bipoc, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Fund. The purpose of this fund is support the identification and preservation of places important to Virginia's Bipoc communities. We recognize that historic places associated with Bipoc folks are still underrepresented in the field of preservation, and this fund is meant to help address that imbalance. Per the bill language, which is linked at the bottom of this screen, the funding is available to nonprofits, recognized tribes, and local governments. The budget allocated $2.5 million each year for the next 2 years for a total Bipock fund of $5 million. That's a pretty large fund for us, and we do plan to spread it out amongst several different projects across the Commonwealth, just as the Commonwealth History Fund has done. Part of the reason that I'm not able to share more details with you, not only the recent nature of this new fund, but also because, as I've told you, we're in the process of hiring someone who will be in charge of administrating it. That's our grants coordinator. So once they're on board, we're looking forward to all of this taking shape quite quickly. Broadly, the Bipoc Fund is intended to support 3 types of preservation projects: the purchase of property and costs associated with that, things like land surveys or purchase closing costs, the identification of historic resources through historic resource survey, and the nomination of properties or areas, historic districts, to the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places. And finally, what we generally refer to as bricks and mortar work, the physical stabilization or rehabilitation of historic resources. I'll point out again, the bill language that includes all of this information is linked at the bottom of the screen. I'll drop it in the chat afterwards as well, so you can get right at that. I encourage you to read it if this fund interests you. The bill also identifies a list of considerations for folks who will be assessing future applications to the Bipoc Fund. Because this is a preservation fund, the money that's spent on eligible activities will need to take place at a historic resource, a building, structure, object, site, property that is significant to Virginia's Bipoc history. We also have, as one of our considerations, the integrity of the resource or resources in question, their ability to convey their historic significance through their form, threats, the ability of the applicant to fund the work and potentially to provide matching funds towards the project, the capacity of the applicant to make the grant-funded work happen, and then to maintain the historic resource after the grant period. Of course, we don't want to see grant funds applied towards a resource that's going to fall into ruin after money has been spent to rehabilitate it. This list is drawn directly from that bill language, and we will develop it further as we build out this program. So as you can see from those slides I've just shown you, whoever steps into that grants manager role is going to have their work cut out for them. As we continue to develop the Bipoc Fund, the manual, the application, and the evaluation process, we will also continue engaging the public on this fund. That engagement will include at least one public information session to share more specifics about the grant. For folks that are interested, the best thing that you can do right now tonight is to make sure that you're staying connected to DHR, regularly checking our webpage. When you go to dhr.virginia.gov, all of our social media is linked at the top of our homepage, our main webpage. I encourage you to engage with our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. More information on the Bipoc Fund will be shared through all of these spaces. So now I want to move on to the Tribal Outreach Coordinator Fund. So the Tribal Outreach Coordinator that we're currently hiring will manage DHR's outreach to Native American communities with the goal of identifying, evaluating, and protecting historic resources associated with Virginia's tribes. This role will manage a small grant fund of $50,000 each state fiscal year to support preservation planning activities within the tribes. $50,000 is not enough to pay for bricks and mortar type projects, so it'll likely be focused more on historic resource identification, National Register of Historic Places nominations, things like that. The person who we're currently hiring for this coordinator role, they will oversee this small pot of money each year, and they will also be responsible for developing the grant manual and the application process. So more to come on this front. Finally, we have our Community Outreach Coordinator Fund. Hopefully, as I've said, some of you have already perhaps worked with Tim Roberts, who I think might also be on the call tonight. Tim's been in his role at DHR for about a year, and Tim's role also has a small grant fund of $50,000 that goes along with it each state fiscal year to support preservation planning activities focused on African American communities. This money is specifically earmarked for the documentation of African American historic resources that have not yet been recorded by the Department of Historic Resources in our survey inventory. So because Tim started his role partway through the last state fiscal year, there was not adequate time to set up an outward-facing grant program associated with that role. So over the last few months, we were able to use the money set aside for the last state fiscal year to fund a few very small projects that had already come to us through other grant programs and fit the bill of the community outreach position. An example being the very recently National Register listed Oak Grove Baptist Church Historic Districts. This is a discontiguous historic district, including a circa 1900 church with its cemetery, a school site, a slightly newer church and associated cemetery, all spread across about a 1.5 square mile area of Northwest York County. The district helps to narrate the vibrant and resilient African American community congregation that worshiped at these two churches, and documents the early stages of segregated public education in York County. So this gives you the flavor of the types of projects that will be funded through that Community Outreach Coordinator Fund. In the coming months, that fund will become public facing to support more African American historic resource identification work. Again, it's $50,000 each state fiscal year, so not enough for bricks and mortar rehabilitation work, but plenty for smaller scale survey, nomination, and the like. So that's an admittedly very high level look at these three new grants. As I've said multiple times, more information will be available soon, and we're going to broadcast that across all of our channels and our webpage. But with my last minute or so, I want to briefly provide some guidance on applying for both these and other historic preservation grant funds. When preparing a grant application for funds to, let's say, rehabilitate an old building or perform a historic resource survey, it is really essential to provide sufficient background information for grant reviewers like myself or like Kathy to understand the historic significance of whatever the focus of your project is, the existing conditions if you're working with a building or another type of historic resource, and the proposed work. I know that I've reviewed so many compelling grant applications that wound up rating lower than they should have, simply because there was not enough information about the historic resource or resources in question. So on the screen here, I'm showing you a set of really wonderful images of the Saxis Island store. These came to us by way of an application to our Hurricane Sandy Fund a handful of years ago, requesting money to rehabilitate the store. And it was a compelling application in part because they provided so much visual material, historic images like the one you see on the top left, great existing conditions where we could really clearly see what was wrong with this building and the work that needed to occur. And so it was kind of an easy choice to fund this project. The nonprofit in charge was able to rehabilitate this store, and it's now a beautiful little museum for Saxis Island that opened up just a few years ago. So I've added kind of just this very general cheat sheet as my last slide here around some of the specific items that are often missing from preservation grant applications and make it challenging for reviewers to assess the overall quality of a project. I'm not going to go through these point by point. So I hope you'll take a screenshot or access this after the presentation is posted. But essentially the message is that we need to have ample information. We need to understand the full extent of the project area or the resource, lots of images, plans, drawings, as much as you can give us so that we can perform a review and adequately assess your grant application. So with that, I'm going to say thank you all so much for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions. I've dropped my contact information right here. I don't run every grant program at DHR, but I can certainly connect you to the other folks who do. And I've also linked DHR's grants webpage at the bottom of the screen. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Blake. And as you can see, there are a variety of funding sources that are available to you and newer funding opportunities that are coming on the horizon. So thank you so much for sharing that information with us. Our final presenter before our Q&A period is going to be our very own Will Glasgow from Preservation Virginia. Will?
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen, Bryan. I appreciate that. It's been wonderful having you on staff. It's really a game changer, not just for the organization, but for me, because Lisa knows a lot more about fundraising than I do. So I'm getting a lot of great advice from her as we move forward in the coming year. But I wanted to say, first of all, to piggyback on what Blake was saying, DHR has been incredibly responsive and helpful for us in the past. I can't stress enough that if you have questions or concerns about a grant process, you really don't have to go it alone. There are grant officers and DHR employees who are happy to field those questions and kind of walk folks through the grant process. I like to say that, this is something that I do for a living, that I do every day, and it's still incredibly difficult. So if folks are volunteering their time to do this kind of work, first of all, hats off to you. You're really a hero. But it can be a lot if it's in addition to your day job. So feel free to reach out to DHR or us or anyone who could help answer some of your grant questions. So I feel like my job tonight, I'm going to share my screen here, is to talk a little bit about fundraising in general, and not just to do sort of a 101 course, because I think some folks probably already know some of this, but really to talk about the world of fundraising, how it relates to grants, private foundations, and how to pay for preservation projects. Because the reality is this is probably in the top 5 questions that we receive on a day-to-day basis at Preservation Virginia. Where is funding? How do we secure funding? And how do we submit these grant applications to pay for this preservation work? And unfortunately, at least in my experience, there's no easy answer to that. It can take years of digging and working and cultivating, but in the end, it's worth it and it's very doable. It's just not something that can happen necessarily in a few weeks or months. But just to give you a quick example, the photo at in the title slide here is of Scotchtown, one of the historic sites that we operate, and we're actually replacing the roof on Scotchtown right now, and it's years in the making. I think we started fundraising for that in like 2018, and as you can see, it's going to be completed this year. So we're pretty excited about that, but it's taken a pretty long time to get a roof on there. So just to give you a quick idea, when I came on in 2014 at Preservation Virginia, we assessed the needs of the organization and realized that there was a lot to do, both at our museum sites as well as our advocacy and community engagement work. So we tried to bundle all of that together into a campaign of sorts. Campaign is almost a little bit of a cliche these days. Everyone's in one, but they do work. If you can kind of package your projects and programs and brand it, as it were, that can really help when you're making the pitch to foundations and donors about why they should support your organization. So rather than kind of approaching things from a one-off or reactive sense, we try to get out in front of the different needs we have in the organization. And I will say that we've had some success with planned gifts and planned giving. It's something to consider that although it thankfully plays out down the road for your donors, it's not necessarily money that will benefit you now. The reality is that substantial gifts can be made through estate plans that can benefit your historic site or project down the road and create that long-term financial sustainability. So certainly keep that in mind. Frankly, there's a lot of ways that folks can can make a huge impact for an organization after they pass away that maybe they can't do now while they have costs and things they have to address. So the planned giving has actually been a great success for us, though. Again, it's not like it's something you'll see tomorrow. But moving along here, I did want to touch a little bit on just sort of the fundraising philosophy at a preservation nonprofit. And the reality is you're not just paying for a project, you have to pay staff or consultants to carry out the work as well. You know, when you can, if you can write in administrative time or staff time into a grant, you really should try to do so when it's allowed in the grant program. It's actually something that we have to remind ourselves a lot at Preservation Virginia when we step into a grant cycle and say, you know, we have this project or program that's really exciting and we want to get it paid for, we want to move forward and make an impact. But if you don't have people that are doing the work, if you don't have folks on the ground, then you know, you can't carry it out. So it's something to consider in grant proposals, and at least in certain programs that allow it. Also, not necessarily the case with DHR or the Virginia Commonwealth Fund here, but a lot of times grant opportunities do require a match. And it kind of adds a layer of uncertainty to your grant when you do have to match it 1-to-1, as in if you got $100,000, you have to then raise $100,000 from the community to show that community engagement to the foundation. So it's just something to keep in mind, that you have to be cultivating individuals and other foundations in the region while you're going after some of these larger state and federal grants. And I wanted to mention too that corporate sponsorships are great. I mean, in a sense that, you know, if you can engage with local businesses to sponsor your projects and programs, that's good. But just keep in mind that a lot of times it's a little bit of a two-way street where these grants can kind of come out of their marketing fund, which is fine, but they're looking for their name on something in a sense. So I've just found in the past that a lot of volunteers or even board members in some cases might think, oh, you know, we need to get this big corporation involved, and that's great, but you know, sometimes it's a little bit of a quid pro quo there, so just keep that in mind. And I did want to mention that when you do secure supporters and donors, the hardest part is really keeping them. You know, the retention rate, as in folks who give a second gift, is fairly low. The national average is under 50%. And in fact, folks who give kind of spur of the moment online is something like 25%, that they won't give a second gift the next year. So it really speaks to how important it is to cultivate supporters and keep them engaged and keep them around. So to speak to that, this graphics always comes as a little bit of a shock. If you look at all of the giving, the billions of dollars that go to nonprofits and projects every year, where does that money come from? And a lot of folks will assume they come from foundations and corporations, but it's just not the case. The overall majority, almost 70%, does come from individual giving, folks in your community who are just passionate about your project and want to, you know, cut a check or go online because they love what you're doing. So just keep in mind that, again, like the grants are very important. You know, not to speak ill of that. I mean, it's a critical part of what you're doing, and it's great seed money to kick off a new project. But at the end of the day, you also, you know, just don't forget that individual supporters are really important in your fundraising needs. And I did want to mention that somewhat unfortunately in the arts and culture and humanities field, it's a little bit of an uphill battle. Where do the donations go? All those billions of dollars from individuals? Well, for the most part, they go to the religious sector or schools, to universities, alma maters, schools, foundations, that kind of thing. So if you look way down the list, arts, culture, and humanities, we're about 5% of this giving pie. So it's still, you know, it's still a lot. There's still a lot of generous folks out there who are very passionate about history. I think history is more relevant now than it's ever been. But it does go to show that, you know, most giving does seem to go to folks, alma maters and churches and things like that. And something that's really changed in the last few years would be folks who use a donor advised fund to make contributions. At least kind of, you know, some of those larger and significant gifts. Basically, the donor advised fund is almost like its own nonprofit that will pull together significant funds from folks who have capacity, and then the donor will tell them where they want that money to go. So in a sense, it's like hiring someone to make your charitable giving for you, which is great. I think that you just have to keep in mind that this is a reality, and you really want to build relationships with community foundations and donor advised funds and just make sure you're on their radar. And at the same time, the donor at the end of the day is the one who makes the decision. So it doesn't really affect the relationship with your supporter, but know that sometimes their gift is going to come through this third party kind of situation, which is fine. But it's just something that's really starting to take off, and we're seeing it more and more. At the same time, a lot of local community foundations do their own grants as well. They are able to pool enough money together that there's money available for them to make their own decisions and give out funds in addition to their shareholders or their supporters, as it were. So keep that in mind. Wherever you're located, chances are there's a community foundation in the region. And if you haven't met with them, reach out. Just similar to other foundations and grants, they are there to answer questions, and they want to find out about what you're doing. Don't do your work in a vacuum. Make sure folks know about it. Get the word out. Have meetings. They want to hear from you, and chances are you might have some luck as a result. And then one more thing, kind of along like the technical side of giving. There are some laws and rules in place when it comes to charitable giving through retirement accounts. Apparently, the average age of the United States donor is 65, which is, right around retirement age. And that's just kind of at a time where folks have paid off, in many cases, a lot of their debt. They're in more of an opportunity to give back and make contributions. And so you see folks at that age starting to give. But a lot of people really don't know about this program. It's something that you can educate your supporters about. And, they really had no idea that they have to take these distributions from their retirement at a certain age, but they can actually contribute those distributions to nonprofits and make a donation from that. So it's something to talk to them about. And I did want to talk about community-centric fundraising. So there's been a lot of discussions around, naming opportunities and recognizing donors. But you always want to be careful. You don't want your donors to necessarily dictate your mission. You want to make sure that there's transparency on both sides, and that you're both well aware of where the money's coming from, what it's supporting, and that you're all on the same page in that sense. You don't want to chase donations too much where it actually starts to alter what your work is. What your mission is, and the vast majority of donors are well aware of that, and you just need to have those conversations up front. At the end of the day, your work is most important, your mission and impact is most important, and your donors will support that if you're having that conversation. And community-centric fundraising, the philosophy there is really about how nonprofits, everyone on this call, we're not in competition with each other. I know there's a limited amount of funds, especially in the arts and culture world, as we just saw. But the reality is we're all on the same team, and we're trying to recognize and preserve historic sites in Virginia. So let's lift each other up and partner and work together to that end. And also, I wanted to mention really quick the growth of online giving. So, most of your major gifts or significant contributions aren't necessarily going to come through your website or social media channels, but it is growing. We are seeing a vast uptick in the amount of folks who are essentially more trustworthy of the web when it comes to making a contribution. What we heard 10, 15 years ago is that folks were a little uneasy about making a gift online. That really seems to be changing, where it's just the convenience of it. And they recognize that a lot of these systems, are secure. So having a robust online presence is a good thing. A lot of times you have to pay for certain software to do that, but there's a lot of different options out there that are very affordable these days. That for the less of like a cell phone bill, you can get an online giving page and try to drive donors to that page. So it is actually increasing. And here at Preservation Virginia, we've really seen that. We've actually seen a 60% increase in online gifts through the pandemic over the last 3 years, that folks are choosing to go online to renew their membership or make a donation. So it is something that's really working for us. And at the same time, I will say that there are a lot of folks who still want to send in a letter and check through the mail, which is totally fine. And it's just something to keep in mind that direct mail marketing is still incredibly important to recruiting and retaining your donors. So don't rely solely online. If you just rely on emails and social media, you'll find that your numbers will start to drop. And speaking of which, the last couple of years, it's just good to know that your marketing and communications and your content really dovetails directly with your fundraising. If you have a lot of content, videos or graphics that you can provide donors, that's important now more than ever. Understandably so, there's still a lot of folks who just aren't comfortable meeting in person. And so if you can't get together and have coffee or have lunch, if it's just not a good thing to do, you can send, a link to your videos or to like a PDF of a document you put together that really makes a case for support, they call it, for your organization. So just keep in mind that these materials are really important to making the case for donors in the digital age. So, for example, our YouTube channel, Sonia was really great about keeping that up for many years, and I hadn't done a whole lot with it, but the last 2 or 3 years, we've all been really pitching in and trying to keep the YouTube channel very full of content. So, and I will mention that the number of folks who are saying that pitches online are influencing their giving is going up as well. It's not a huge slice of the pie, but 29% of people do say that things they see as they're scrolling on their phone in terms of projects and programs that are happening are influencing where they give. So you do want to have that presence online. So let's really get to the meat of it. The reality is, again, we get those phone calls every day. Where do I get funding? How do we fund these projects and programs that are so important to our community? And the reality is in the digital age online, a lot of this information is already there. It's at your fingertips through Google that you can identify private foundations and public grant opportunities, as well as individuals who have been philanthropic, and identify if they're people and places you should be visiting with and talking with. So just as a quick refresher, and we'll talk more about this on Thursday night. If you haven't signed up for the second webinar in the series on Thursday night, I encourage you to do so because the federal grants through grants.gov are, really important, but kind of can be a little bit tricky. There's a lot to fill out there, but it's worth it in the end. But sign up for that webinar if you have a chance. But I would say that if you register through grants.gov, they do have an email newsletter they send out that talks a little bit about some of their upcoming opportunities. But you can also sign up literally for a list of grant opportunities coming up through grants.gov that they can either send out every day or every week, depending on what you're looking for. And you can even sort of drill down the different topics and programs that you can apply to. So I would encourage you to go online and do that. There's also online platforms like historicfunding.com or Donor Search, where you can find a lot of information about grant opportunities that are out there. Historic Funding is actually a new platform that I really like, where you can search certain keywords and phrases and drill down different foundations around the country interested in preservation. And finally, Candid and Charity Navigator are incredibly important. If you have a nonprofit you're working on, make sure you're listed there and that your profile is up to date. Donors are looking at that information. They want to know that there's transparency there. They can look at your 990 forms. If you file tax forms, that kind of thing. So make sure those profiles are up to date. But at the same time, Candid and Charity Navigator, it's not just for the donor, it's for you as well. You can look up a lot of information on private foundations there, including their 990s, which often will show different nonprofits that they've given to in the past. And finally, I'm going to wrap up. This is my last slide here. Where to spend your time. So studies show that 88% of donations actually come from 12% of your donors, meaning that a significant chunk of pie in terms of your operating budget or program budget come from a small amount of people or foundations, as in they make significant contributions. So I like to think at Preservation Virginia, we really want to make all of our members and donors feel supported, but just know if you're launching a new project or program that you have to be kind of careful about your time, and that you only have but so much of it. So just make sure you're meeting with those folks who are going to help you get to that next level. Get to know your supporters, your grant officers at private foundations, state and federal foundations. They want to hear from you. They will review your application in many instances and give you advice. So don't be afraid to reach out if you have questions. And honestly, it's just like when you were in class in school. It was the teacher would always tell me to read the directions before I take the quiz, and I would often skip that and just start taking it. And then you miss something, always read the directions, read them really close. They can be really long and cumbersome, but read through them and make sure you're checking on the boxes they're looking for. And the last, I guess my parting word of, whatever wisdom I can impart would be, folks are very generous. Donating and giving to nonprofits is actually for them in a sense that it's fulfilling. It helps with their own legacy and their own giving back to society. People are going to make donations. They're going to give gifts. It's just whether they give to you or not. So, if you don't ask, it won't be you. So you just can't be afraid to ask and make sure folks understand the impact you're making in your community. So I hope this was a little bit helpful, but we really appreciate DHR and the Virginia Museum of History and Culture coming on board and helping us get this information out. So Dr. Nguyen, Bryan.
Thank you, Will. That was excellent. I really liked how you framed the fundraising program as a whole and how we look at it overall and different segments of our, what we call our fundraising pie. And that it is true that individuals are a main supporter of most of what we do in philanthropy. So that was excellent. So I'm glad everyone's back on screen. We are going to our Q&A period. Thank you all for hanging in there. Some questions have come through. And so we're just going to open it up to any other questions you might have. Please put that in the chat. I'm going to start with Kathy. There was a question about minimums and maximum amounts that are available as you talked about the grant program. Can you talk about or emphasize again those amounts for us? You're on mute. There you go.
We want to fund several projects. So, several projects in the $25,000 to $50,000 range. Our largest grant was $75,000 for this initial round. And in some cases, if it's a compelling project and application, it might be $100,000, in excess of $100,000. And in rare cases, it could be much larger. It all depends on the proposal, the support of the community, again, looking at underrepresented communities and the scope of who's going to be impacted by the project.
And Kathy, could you emphasize, and I know a couple of folks talked about this, if you don't receive a grant in one round, is it okay to apply for the next year or an upcoming round?
Absolutely. We encouraged, we had close to 60 applications come in, and they were all compelling projects. Just some were more urgent for fund, the need for funding was more urgent in certain cases. So yes, I have everybody who, unfortunately, we didn't fund this year. I have encouraged them to come back.
That's good.
And the one thing that we don't have, unlike DHR, is that I'm more of a grant manager. I'm not a grant officer. So I try to help you. I want you to be successful, but I'm limited in what I can give you as far as information to make your application more compelling.
Well, that's good to know. We can keep trying.
Absolutely.
Keep trying.
Absolutely.
Okay. Blake, there was a question for you. Given that property acquisition often takes multiple years to collect several funding sources, what are the requirements in terms of how quickly applicants have to appropriate and then actually spend those funds?
That is a great question. Thank you very much for asking that, Ellen. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the bill language into the chat. The bill language for the Bipock Fund, and I've got it right up here on the screen, so I'm just reading you what's in there. This is a special non-reverting fund. And then later in that same section, at the end of each state fiscal year shall not revert to the general fund, but remain in the Bipock Fund. So based on the language in the bill, it appears that we'll have more than just the state fiscal year to spend down that 2.5 and then additional 2.5 for a total of 5. That will be clarified in upcoming public information sessions and other material we put out. I will definitely move this question to the top of the list of many questions that we'll need to address during those sessions, because I certainly recognize that all sorts of projects take more than the length of a state fiscal year. I will add, though, that the 2 smaller funds I described associated with the Tribal Outreach Coordinator and Tim Roberts' community outreach position, those are state fiscal year limited. So yet another reason why we're looking at smaller survey nomination projects for those, because we do have to spend down those $50,000 each state fiscal year, so July to June. So
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. And Tim is on with us, so thank you for joining us. So Elizabeth, you know, this is a lot of information. And sometimes you may be just someone, this is your first time trying to make a submission for a grant. Could you talk about, do you need a professional grant writer, or is there something that organizations or churches or schools should be doing to help make a stronger grant proposal?
That's a great question, Lisa. And I think it's one we struggle with sometimes too. And oftentimes I've found that you can ask, as Will said, you talk to the grants officers or in federal programs, you can talk to them and they may even send you past successful grant applications. So you can see how things are organized, how people have phrased things, what kind of supplemental materials might be helpful in making the case for your particular request. I also think something we find as a fault when our team is reviewing sort of drafts that we're passing around for our requests, sometimes we get so lost in the weeds, we hide the real lead and the real request. We spend a lot of time talking about, you want to emphasize the historic nature and all of those things, but you also want to say, what are you doing? What, in really plain language, what are you trying to accomplish in this this grant, with these grant funds? So there are consultants out there, to be specific, Lisa, there are consultants out there, and there is a bit of a science to it, but I think it's also everyone, if you are very precise and thoughtful, you can make a compelling request for these grant applications.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Here's some follow-up, Blake. For the Bipock Fund, could a grantee make sub-grants to restore privately owned properties?
So that question is not directly spelled out in the bill language. So I'm gonna have to put that one on hold, and I will, again, add it to a list of questions that we'll need to address as we build out the program. But I definitely understand the desire there, and so I'll make sure that's addressed at a later date.
Okay, thank you. To anyone, as you're reviewing these grant proposals, is there an opportunity for feedback or to understand what may have separated someone else's proposal from your proposal? Is there an opportunity? Because I know, as Kathy, you talked about getting over 60 applications. And so people may try to reach out or may want to talk to you or someone who's responsible for those funds. So is there a way to provide feedback to applicants? And that can be to anyone.
Well, I'll go first. For our state grants, we welcome the opportunity to provide feedback. We are a state agency, so the materials that we produce by way of these grants, things like rating sheets. It's all public information, but rather than requesting all those rating sheets, which you're welcome to do, I and the other folks who work on grants at DHR, we appreciate having, a conversation with grant applicants who are not successful, where we can really talk through the finer points of why. And sometimes, as Kathy pointed out, it just has to do with volume. Some years on our various grant programs, we get way more applications and we have to be much more selective. But certainly we love to have follow-up with our applicants who we aren't able to advance, with the hope that they'll reapply, come back to us, alter the project perhaps, and we'll be able to fund them at a later date.
Thank you. Will, you talked about community and support of the community. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Are these like grassroots efforts, or what are some thoughts that you have? Is it citywide, organizational wide? What are your thoughts about community?
Right. Well, thanks, Lisa. And I think that the emphasis seems to just be on your community impact, and that making sure you're not so focused on where your next dollar is coming from that you're losing sight of what your mission and your impact is. At the same time, we are really in an age where I think grassroots fundraising and online peer-to-peer campaigns have a way of sort of going viral and taking off. And there are ways to do that successfully. You just can't always count on it, working every time. Like a lot of times I have folks ask, like, oh, we should do like a GoFundMe or something like that. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I do think you never want to lose sight of what your mission is, which ties back to what Elizabeth was saying about impact. And what we found is that with some of the historic sites that we've worked with or actually own, it's not even so much what we're doing with the exterior of the building to protect it. Putting the roof on is great, but a lot of funders want to know what's going on inside. What's happening underneath the roof to make it important. Are school children being affected? Are folks coming out and visiting? What kind of programs and projects you're doing that are getting in front of people? You can't do this work in a vacuum. So I think all that connects in that way. And I will say, really quick with the feedback from foundations, unfortunately, sometimes with private foundations and even with federal ones, what you find is that the feedback you get going in from the grant officer, they're not really the ones making the decisions, though. There's either a board of directors or a review panel who then takes that grant and reads it, and they might not quite see it the same way that even you and the officer did. So you'll get feedback that surprises you a little bit. So I think that it's always a learning experience. Even if you get your narrative reviewed ahead of time, it still might not go through, and you'll find out what those panelists were looking for later. So,
And I think too, what you were talking about, Blake, when you talk about the volume and of applicants and how you have peak years, I think that happens in fundraising and an annual fund or support with corporations, depending on what's happening. During the pandemic, there was a shift to support efforts that have been impacted by the pandemic. And so now you see corporations slowly moving back to some of the community efforts that they were supporting before. So you see that happening all over, just depending on what is occurring in our country, and will depend on where the dollars will go. So excellent. There was one question, I think this is for you, Kathy. Does the Commonwealth History Fund require a match?
No, it does not require a match.
Okay.
But if you have sought funds as a matching grant to this request, we'd like to know about it, and it makes it more compelling.
Okay. And do you have to be on the national register for that as well, or?
No.
Historical. Okay. All right.
Not with us.
Okay.
Say not with us. I'm not sure about DHR, but not for us. We hope to make it as easy as possible to give this money away, but there are steps and processes in place to submit the proposal, the review process, and then the actual awarding and the follow-up with that with final reports.
Okay.
And financials. Yeah.
Good. So if everyone would share just in closing, where should I start? I've heard everything that you said today. I'm ready to go back to my organization, to my church, to my school. What should we do with the information that you've shared with us today? Where would you start? And I'll start with Kathy.
I think it was Blake who mentioned Will who mentioned read the guidelines. And if you have questions, if it's not clear to you, if you're new to writing grants, which I've been on that side of the fence too, ask questions to get a better definition that you understand so that you can answer those questions appropriately. And I know some people are very new to grant writing, and there are resources out there. There are consultants out there, really great consultants in the city of Richmond that you can work with. There are networking groups, FAFRI, AFP. There's a grant professionals group. I forget their exact name, but they exist in our state. So there are resources to help you find somebody to help you write a grant.
Wonderful. And we'll try and share some of those links as we correspond with you after this webinar today. Blake, what is the takeaway?
Sure. So I would say the first one is make sure that you're connected to the many different sources that may bring you grant opportunities. So I talked about all of DHR social media, of course, Preservation Virginia, and there are many others. And the other one is to, before you've even selected the grant you want to apply for, even know of a grant out there that might match your needs, start collecting documentation of your project or your historic resource or whatever the focus of your future grant application is going to be, so that when that opportunity presents itself, you are ready with all of those necessary pieces that I was describing at the end of my portion that the grant reviewers will need to assess the quality of your project. That's something you can get started on before you've even started a specific application to a certain fund or grant.
So follow all of your social media and sign up for newsletters and everything. I think I've signed up for everyone's contact information. Will, what are your thoughts? Where do we start?
Sure, thanks, Lisa. And I think kind of getting back to the community angle of all this and getting way out in front of the grant due dates, it's coordinating and getting your allies and partners on board in the community, and whether that's trying to get them excited about the project, for example, if there is a match required, or if it's actually getting a letter of support. Because I will say that another component of grants that can come up a lot is they'll ask for letters from civic leaders or community members who explain why that this is an important project. You don't want to do that the week or day before. And I've been in that position before, shamedly. So, get those letters way in advance, And so, but I think that also gets back to getting folks excited about the project and knowing that even when the end of that grant cycle is over, you have supporters in the community who are going to continue to fund that work long into the future.
That's good. I think too, looking at, and shout out to my friends at Rocky Branch School and Rocky Branch Baptist Church and Dinwiddie, you look at people who do it well, who've done it well, who've been successful. Look at the list. And I think everyone talked about lists that are public, the awardees, grant awardees, and knowing who they are to see, what did they do differently, and what are some things that we can do to make sure that our proposal is a winner. So at least if it's not for this cycle, maybe for an upcoming cycle. Elizabeth, if you'll close us out with your thoughts.
Well, thank you all. I want to thank everybody for the panelists and for the great presentations, and really for the great work that you enable and empower communities to accomplish. The grants that you all represent are so important. And I want to thank everybody that attended. Hopefully you've learned something, and we'll hear about the successful programs and grants that you apply for in the future. My words of advice are about being organized ahead of things. And that's sort of at the heart of what all of you have said, but it is reading that application. It's gathering the team of people that are going to help you with the application. It's gathering the material, whether that's photographs or the history or the consultant's report and budget. We didn't talk much about budget, but having a good budget to go forward so that you're ready. And Will touched on it, but it deserves emphasis. How is this going to change the program? How is it going to impact the community? How is it going to serve your mission? Are all important things to include as you put that grant together. And I think that sort of leads us in, and it's been alluded to, but we have a second session on Thursday that's going to focus on some of the national and federal programs, including the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, that's the National Trust Program, and the National Park Service that has a varied array of grant programs. You'll learn that evening also how to sort of organize this information and be ready to put that application, that successful application together. So I hope you'll join us on Thursday for our next session. And again, thank you all to our panelists. You've given us all things to think about, and I'm sure we'll start to percolate with questions we should have asked. So thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us. We hope to see you on Thursday evening, and everyone have a great night. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye. Stay
Thanks,
dry.
everyone. Good
Take
luck.
care.